We're speaking with the One Nation MLC for South Australia, the first, in fact, One Nation MLC for South Australia, Sarah Game. Sarah, welcome to Flow.
Thanks so much.
Now, you've got this concern, I see a petition on your website, indeed, about the First Nations voice. Now, this is not the one being debated federally. This is about a voice to the South Australian Parliament.
That's right, and thanks for making that clear, because I think a lot of South Australians are in fact not clear that we're legislating our own South Australian First Nations voice and not waiting for the referendum.
That's right, and this is one we've done a little bit of analysis of what was proposed in South Australia. What do you understand to be the structure of how this voice is going to work? Is it going to be broken down into regions? They almost look like electorates.
Exactly. I'm very happy to explain. I've read the draft bill and I can certainly go into the detail. I guess I also want to say that for me, no amount of detail is going to make the concept of race-based legislation okay, and I can explain that further after. But my understanding is we're going to end up with 40 elected members. So we're going to have 6 elected members from 5 different regions. Those regions the boundaries of those regions have not been delineated yet, which is a really big problem when I speak to the Aboriginal community. They're very concerned about why the boundaries aren't established. So we'll have 30 elected members from the regions, and then we'll have another 10 elected members representing the metropolitan area, making 40 elected members for this voice to Parliament. Those 40 elected members, from within that group, there'll be another 10 elected members who then make a sort of state First Nations voice. We've got a very kind of, in my opinion, clunky system of a state First Nations voice liaising with local First Nations voices, all liaising with the clerk, and obviously then, I guess, attempting to make various representations to Parliament.
Yeah, now that's what fascinates me about this proposal, whilst what the federal government is talking about, and that could be a distraction for this conversation, but they're not talking about necessarily a separate chamber or body. But this one in South Australia that the Malinauskas Labor government is putting in place, it has a right to actually appear in the Parliament. It really is functioning almost like additional seats in the Parliament.
Exactly, and I also think that without understanding how if even we're going to have this federally established voice, I think to spend millions of taxpayer money establishing a state-based voice, you've got to think, well, we're going to have these local First Nations voices interacting with the state First Nations voices, interacting potentially, I guess, with a federal established voice. Without really understanding how the overarching concept is going to work, I don't think we should be going ahead. And for me, it strikes me as more of a driven by ego, in fact, that Labor would like South Australia to be the first, rather than really taking the time to consider if this is the right thing and how to go about it correctly.
And this voice, or this body of this dozens of MPs, or whatever you want to call them, voices that have been elected to this body, what right will they have to actually speak in the Parliament? Can they go and turn up if they want to speak on anything in particular, or what's the process?
Exactly. Well, I think I've got 2 concerns related to what you've just raised, which is, yes, firstly, they absolutely do have the right to turn up and make representations, which unfortunately refocuses us back onto race, because if we're making it a race-based legislation, suddenly we're looking at people thinking, well, hang on, let's make sure you are, in fact, Aboriginal, and I really think that's a backward step for society to be thinking that way. But my other problem with the concept really is that when you look at the legislation, these 40 elected members who will all be paid a salary of some sort, they're not actually required to do anything. So they have got a whole lot of options. They may make representations, they may make parliamentary reports, they may meet with Cabinet, they may produce an annual report, but actually, according to the legislation, they don't have to do anything. And I think that makes a real risk here, that we're going to spend all this money and time establishing this voice and actually still leave these communities in despairing conditions without proper representation.
So would they function like MPs in the sense they'd have constituents? I mean, there's people that have voted for them. Would they have to service those constituents, or would that be double handling with already having not only a lower house MP for their seat, but also upper house MPs to represent them?
Exactly. Well, these are all very good questions. I don't feel the legislation's actually very slim, I'd say, on the detail. And so I think to really answer that further is probably going to have to be going through the real process of parliamentary debate. And as you know, unfortunately, I'm the only person speaking out with concern about this at the moment. And I find that really surprising, because certainly everywhere I go in the community, when I raise this or it's raised with me, there are lots of people from rural and regional areas, city-based areas, and particularly lots of people of faith who believe everyone should be treated equally, who are really upset by the establishment of this voice, and yet they're not being represented properly in Parliament. As far as I know, I'm the only one speaking out about it.
Yes, so that's. I noticed the opposition. I haven't seen any commentary from them at all about this voice to Parliament at the state level. Not a single statement from them. And yet, then you've got the Malinauskas government has given its stamp of approval, as have all state governments, to the federal proposal for a voice to the federal Parliament. It does seem that it's all sort of just rolling along happily with a bipartisan Liberal-Labor approach to it.
Well, that is how it seems, and I would say that the Liberal Party here are completely out of touch with their constituents, because a lot of Liberal voters do not want this. And it's a real distraction. I mean, it's quite obvious what we need to be doing. I mean, we already know, first 1,000 days of a child's life, regardless of what race you are vitally important. We need to ensure all children are safe, have nutrition, families have support to stay together. We already know we've got a big problem with attendance, particularly amongst our Aboriginal youth. If you don't go to school, you're not going to get employment. We're not going to close the gap. We already know we've got a very big problem with transparency about where money's being spent. We spend twice as much money on an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander as we do a non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And you speak to the Aboriginal community and they will tell you they don't see this money. So the idea that we're going to establish this voice and it's somehow going to shed light it's just ridiculous. We already know what's wrong and we should be getting on with it.
State Parliament's resuming for 2023 on Tuesday. Have you got any indication? You mentioned the government sort of wants to get in ahead perhaps of the federal push for a voice to Parliament. Is there any indication they'll be in a rush to get this done in the first sitting weeks of 2023?
Absolutely. I can say with confidence this will be being brought up in the first sitting week of 2023. And unfortunately, I suspect it will be rushed through, but I'll be doing my best to raise all the questions that the community need answered.
Well, as I mentioned, there is a petition on the One Nation website, onenation.org.au, about this particular bill, and get in touch with Sarah Game, MLC, if you've got concerns. Sarah, thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks so much.